You are staring at a clay cylinder the size of your fist. It is covered in tiny wedge marks, and it lists the names of kings who ruled for 28,000 years each. Here is the claim I am going to prove to you tonight. When modern artificial intelligence was pointed at the oldest written records humanity ever made, it did not just translate them. It confirmed that the Sumerians wrote down a version of our own origin story that mainstream history spent a century calling myth. And the reason it was dismissed for so long is that no human translator could read fast enough to see the pattern hiding in the numbers. Everything I am about to show you traces back to a single object catalogued in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, under the name the Weld-Blundell Prism, carved around 1800 years before the Common Era. This is not legend. This is a real artifact you can look up tonight, and what it says has never stopped bothering me. I remember the exact moment this stopped being a hobby for me. I was sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, comparing two translation lines side by side, and I realized the machine had flagged something 3 separate scholars had quietly skipped over. My coffee went cold. I did not sleep. Let me take you back to the beginning of this, because the beginning is where the official story already starts to wobble. The Sumerians are the oldest civilization we can name. They lived in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq more than 5,000 years ago. They invented the wheel that we still argue about. They invented the 60-minute hour you looked at today. And they invented writing itself, pressing a cut, reed into wet clay, to make marks we now call cuneiform. For most of the last 150 years, reading those marks was one of the hardest jobs in all of scholarship. There are only a few hundred people alive who can read cuneiform fluently. The script has more than 1,000 distinct signs. A single sign can mean a whole word, or a single sound, or a silent marker that tells you how to read the sign next to it. And the same sign can mean completely different things depending on the era and the city it was written in. So here is the problem that sat unsolved for generations. We have recovered somewhere around 500,000 cuneiform tablets from the sands of Iraq. 500,000. And the overwhelming majority of them have never been translated by anyone because there simply are not enough human experts and there are not enough years in their lives to do it. That is the gap. That is the crack in the wall. And that is where the machine walked in. In the year 2023, a team based mostly at Tel Aviv University published something that should have been front page news everywhere. A researcher named Shai Gordon, working with a computer scientist named Guy Guthers and their colleagues, built a neural machine translation model, the same kind of technology that powers the translation app on your phone, but they trained it on the dead language of the Sumerians and their successors, the Akkadians. They published the results in a journal called PNAS Nexus, and the model could take a line of cuneiform and produce a readable English sentence in a fraction of a second. Work that took a trained human scholar an afternoon now took less time than it takes you to blink. Now here is why that matters for the mystery. When you can suddenly read fast, you can suddenly compare. You can line up 1,000 tablets and look for the pattern across all of them at once. No single human brain can hold 500,000 documents in memory. A machine can. And when researchers started feeding the oldest historical documents into these tools and cross-referencing them, one text kept lighting up as the strangest thing in the entire archive. That text is the Sumerian King List. Let me tell you exactly what the Sumerian King List is, because most people have never heard of it, and once you understand it, you will not be able to let it go either. The King List is not one tablet. It is a document that was copied and recopied for centuries, and the most complete surviving version is that clay prism in Oxford I mentioned. It is a 4-sided column of baked clay, standing about 8 inches tall, with a hole bored through the center as if it was meant to spin on a spindle. Every surface is packed with cuneiform, and what it contains is a straightforward, matter-of-fact list. It names the kings of Sumer, one after another, city by city, and it tells you how long each one ruled. It reads like a government record, dry, administrative, bookkeeping, except for the numbers. The list opens with a line that has haunted me for years. It says, "And I am giving you the standard scholarly translation that when kingship first descended from heaven, kingship was in a city called Eridu. And the first king of Eridu was a man named Alulim. And Alulim, the list states plainly, ruled for 28,800 years. Read that again. One man, 28,800 years on the throne. The next king, a man named Alangar, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 kings in total before a certain event I will get to. And when you add up all 8 of those reigns, the total comes to 241,200 years. 241,000 years of rule by 8 men, written down as sober historical record by the people who invented recorded history. Now stop and feel how strange that is. These same Sumerians were meticulous accountants. They tracked sacks of barley down to the last handful. They recorded the sale of a single goat with the buyer, the seller, and the witness. They were not fantasists. They were the most obsessive record keepers of the ancient world. And these careful, literal people wrote that their first kings lived for tens of thousands of years each, and they filed it in the same tone they used for grain receipts. For a long time, the answer historians gave was simple. They said it was mythology. They said the huge numbers were just a way of saying, long ago and glorious, a kind of poetic exaggeration to make the ancient kings sound divine. Case closed, move along. And for most of the 20th century, that was good enough, because no one could examine the whole picture at once. But therefore, when the translation tools got fast enough to line up every version of the list side by side, a much stranger detail came into focus. And it is a detail that the myth explanation does not survive. Here is what the reanalysis revealed. If these numbers were just random, poetic exaggeration, they should be messy. Made-up big numbers usually are. But when researchers who study the list, going back to careful work by a scholar named Dwight Young in the late 1980s, actually broke the reign lengths down, they found the numbers were not random at all. They were built on a system the Sumerians counted in base 60, not base 10 like we do. Their entire mathematics ran on the number 60, which is exactly why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. And when you examine the antediluvian rain numbers, they turn out to be clean products within that base 60 system. 28,800 is 60 squared multiplied by 8. The rains are not gibberish. They are deliberate mathematical constructions. That is not what a random myth looks like. That is what an encoded record looks like. Somebody was doing math. Somebody was preserving something and translating it into their own number language. And that raised the question that pulled me all the way down this rabbit hole and would not let go. If the numbers are a code and not a fantasy, then what is being encoded? What real thing were they counting? If you have been sitting with that question the same way I did, unable to shake it, I want to point you towards something I put together outside of this channel. It is a series of 3 digital books called First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems, available at lostorigins.org for $97. In them, I go through the full decoded structure of these numbers, the cross-cultural flood parallels, and the physical evidence layer by layer with the sources laid out so you can pull every thread yourself. The link is in the description below. But before I answer that, I have to show you the line in the list that turns the whole thing from a curiosity into a genuine mystery. Because after those 8 impossibly long-lived kings, the king list does something no one expected a bookkeeping document to do. It records a disaster. The line comes right after the 8th king, and it says, in plain wedge marks pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, that the flood swept over. The flood swept over. Then the list says that after the flood had swept over, kingship once again descended from heaven, and it starts a brand new sequence of kings in a new city. Now think about what you are actually holding here. This is a document older than the Hebrew Bible by well over 1,000 years. Older than Genesis. Older than the story of Noah that most of the world grew up with. And it divides all of human history into 2 halves. Before the flood and after the flood. Exactly like the Bible does. Written down by a completely different people in a completely different language more than a millennium earlier. The first time I read that transition line in the original numbering, the hair on my arm stood up. Because I had assumed, like you probably did, that the Great Flood was a biblical story, a piece of scripture, and here it was, sitting in a museum in Oxford, carved by people who had never heard of the Bible because the Bible would not exist for another 1,000 years, and here is where the numbers get even more interesting. Because after the flood, the reign lengths in the king list start to drop. The kings before the flood ruled for tens of thousands of years. The first kings after the flood rule for shorter spans, still long but shorter. And as you move down the list, the reigns keep shrinking century by century until eventually you reach kings who ruled for perfectly normal human lifetimes. 20 years, 30 years, 6 years. The numbers descend from the impossible to the ordinary in a smooth curve, just like the ages in the book of Genesis, where the earliest patriarchs lived for 900 years and their descendants gradually drop toward a normal human span. Two separate civilizations, two separate languages, the same exact structure, a time of impossibly long lives, then a flood, then lives that shrink toward the human. That is not the kind of coincidence you can wave away. So let me stop here and speak directly to the part of you that is pushing back right now, because I know some of you are the careful type, the ones who do not fall for a good story. And honestly, this next part is for you specifically. I was you. I spent months trying to make the boring explanation work because I wanted it to work. Let me walk you through the case against everything I just said as fairly as I can, and then show you where it cracks. The skeptical explanation goes like this. The Sumerian King List is not a history book. It is political propaganda. Scholars have known this for a long time, and they are largely right about it. The list was almost certainly assembled to make one particular city look like the legitimate heir to all the kingship that came before it. By presenting a single unbroken line of kings passing the crown from city to city, whoever commissioned the list was making a claim. They were saying, all authority has always flowed through one channel, and that channel now runs through us. It was a way of justifying power, and the skeptic says the long reigns are simply part of that propaganda. Make your founding kings semi-divine, give them superhuman lifespans, and your dynasty looks blessed by the gods. The flood, the skeptic says, is just a convenient dividing line, a dramatic reset button, and floods were common in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley anyway. The whole thing in this reading is a mixture of politics and legend, with maybe a few real names sprinkled in for flavor. I want to be honest with you. That explanation is strong. It accounts for a lot. The propaganda purpose of the list is real, and any serious person has to take it seriously. But here is exactly where it breaks. If the entire early section is invented propaganda, then the names in it should be invented too. Fictional founders for a fictional golden age. That is the prediction the skeptical theory makes. Made up ancient kings to glorify the dynasty, and that prediction is testable because we can go into the ground and look for those kings. That is where this stopped being a debate about interpretation for me and became a question of physical evidence buried in the sand. So follow me carefully, because this is the turn. There is a king in the list named Enmi-Barajazi. He appears in the section after the flood as a ruler of the city of Kish, and for a long time he was treated as exactly the kind of figure the skeptics predicted. A name in a mythologized list, a character who also shows up in the legendary Gilgamesh stories, the epic tales full of monsters and gods and immortality quests. If any king on that list was going to be pure fiction, the smart money said it was a name tangled up with the Gilgamesh legends. And then archaeologists put a spade in the dirt. In the middle of the 20th century, excavators recovered inscribed fragments, pieces of a stone vessel and other objects, bearing an inscription with his name and title, a real inscription. A physical object made during his reign or close to it, bearing the name of a king who, until that moment, existed only as a line in a list that everyone had filed under myth. Enmi-Barajazi is now accepted as a genuine, historical, flesh and blood king. One of the earliest historical individuals we can name anywhere on earth. He was real, he was there, he ruled the city of Kish, and his existence was confirmed not by faith in the list, but by an object pulled out of the ground with his name carved into it. Do you understand what that does to the skeptical case? The theory said the early kings were invented. The dirt said at least one of them was absolutely real. And once one supposedly mythical name turns out to be a documented historical person, you can no longer wave your hand at the whole list and call it fantasy. The document that records a flood dividing human history, the document with the impossible lifespans encoded in base 60 mathematics, is the same document that correctly preserved the name of a real king across 4,000 years when the experts assumed he never existed. That is the moment the official story stopped adding up for me. Because the list has now been proven right about something everyone assumed it was wrong about. So what else in it is, right? And this is exactly where the modern machine analysis becomes so important and where the story gets genuinely unsettling. Remember the problem I described at the start. 500,000 tablets, almost none of them translated, a tiny handful of human experts who could never read them all in 100 lifetimes. For over a century, our entire picture of the earliest human civilization has been built on the small fraction of tablets that happen to get translated by the small number of people who happen to have the time. Now think about what that means. It means the deciding was not done by evidence, it was done by bandwidth. There was simply too much to read, so scholars translated the tablets that seemed important, summarized them, and moved on. The King List got summarized as propaganda, the huge numbers got summarized as myth, and that summary became the textbook answer, not because anyone had read everything and ruled out the alternatives, but because no one could read everything at all. That is not a conspiracy. It is worse in a way. It is a truth that got buried under sheer volume, sitting in plain sight in museum drawers, unread, for generations, because the workload was physically impossible for human beings. And here is where I have to tell you the part that keeps me up at night. When the artificial intelligence models were turned loose on this material, the researchers themselves, in their own published papers, admitted something remarkable. The machine sometimes produced translations that were fluent, confident, grammatically perfect, and completely wrong. They called these hallucinations. The model would generate a beautiful, plausible sentence that did not match the actual signs on the tablet. Now, most people hear that and think, well, that means we cannot trust the machine. And that is a fair worry. But sit with the deeper implication for a second. If a machine can produce a smooth, confident, believable translation that is not actually what the tablet says, then how do we know the human translators of the last 150 years never did the same thing? How much of what we think the ancient world said is actually a confident guess by a tired scholar filling in a broken line passed down as fact because no one could check it against the other 500,000 tablets? The AI did not just give us a faster translator. It held up a mirror. And in that mirror, we can finally see how shaky some of the old certainties always were. So the researchers built the tools to work alongside human experts, machine and scholar, checking each other. And when you do that, when you combine the speed of the machine with the judgment of the specialist, you can finally do the thing that was never possible before. You can cross-reference the King List against the entire surviving body of early inscriptions at once. You can ask the question, the textbook skipped. How many of the names on this supposedly mythical list can we now match to real, physical, dated evidence pulled from the ground? And the answer, block by block as the archaeology has come in over the decades, keeps climbing. Enme-Barajesi, confirmed. Other early rulers increasingly attested by inscriptions and cross-references that the fast comparison tools make easier to spot than ever before. The list keeps passing tests it was never supposed to pass. The line between the mythical section and the historical section keeps sliding backward toward the flood, toward the impossible numbers, toward the beginning, which brings me, finally, to the thing I promised you at the very start. The detail that made me put down my coffee at 2 in the morning and stare at the wall. The piece that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Go back to those rain numbers before the flood. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. 241,200 years in total. We established they are not random. They are built on the base 60 system, clean mathematical products, a deliberate code. Here is what the closest analysis of that code reveals. When you take the King List numbers and apply the same base 60 logic that runs through all of Sumerian mathematics, the reigns are not measuring what we assumed. Scholars who have worked this problem following that thread from Dwight Young onward have shown that the astronomical figures are constructed from the Sumerians' own number base in a way that a scribe would recognize instantly and a modern reader would completely miss. The numbers were never meant to be read as birthdays to death. They were a notation, a way of recording an order, a sequence, a scale of time compressed into the sacred mathematics of 60. In other words, the Sumerians were not claiming a man lived 28,000 years. They were encoding a length of time, or an era, in the only mathematical language they had, and doing it with a precision that survived 4,000 years intact for a machine to finally decompress. And that is the buried treasure at the center of this whole thing. The number that history laughed at, the 28,800 years that got the entire list dismissed as fairy tale, is not the evidence that the Sumerians were fantasists. It is the evidence that they were doing something far more sophisticated than we gave them credit for. They were keeping records so carefully in a number system so alien to ours that we mistook their precision for madness. They were not lying about a golden age. They were the first people on Earth to try to write down deep time, to reach back past living memory, past their grandparents, into an era they could no longer name person by person, and to preserve it anyway, in code, in clay, in the mathematics of 60. And they marked the great dividing line of that deep time with 3 words that a machine pulled back into the light for us. The flood swept over. The evidence was always there. It sat in a museum in Oxford, and in drawers full of untranslated tablets, and in the dirt over the buried name of a king everyone said was a myth. It was dismissed, not by malice, but by the simple human impossibility of reading 500,000 documents. It was preserved by the obsessive Sumerian scribes who copied that list for centuries, refusing to let the deep past be forgotten. And now, because a machine finally learned to read faster than any human ever could, you are holding it. The oldest record humanity ever wrote does not begin with a myth. It begins with a memory of a time before, an age that ended in water, and a careful, mathematical attempt to count the uncountable years on the other side of that flood. That is the feeling I could never shake, and now I have handed it to you. The suspicion that the people we call primitive were quietly more precise than we are, and that we called their records fairy tales only because we were not yet smart enough to read them. If you are the kind of person who has always felt that the neat, tidy answer in the textbook was hiding something messier and more human underneath, then you already understand why I could not let this one go. You do not accept the summary. You want the tablet itself. So let me ask you something specific, and I genuinely want you to answer this one. That transition line, the flood swept over, written more than 1,000 years before Genesis by people who never heard of Noah. Do you think both stories are remembering the same real event, or do you think it is coincidence? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them and I want to know how far this reaches. If this rearranged something in your head tonight, stay with me here. This is what we do. We reopen the cases everyone else marked as closed, and we pull the threads the experts were too busy to pull. Next time, I am going in on another buried number, a measurement carved into ancient stone that should not have been possible for the people who carved it, and the modern survey that proved it was exact. You will not want to miss what the instruments found. I hope this stayed with you, because we're only at the surface. Join me inside the Unexplained Society, where I pick up right where I stopped. In there you can ask me your own question, and I answer you myself. Not some machine. You belong here with thousands of mystery lovers like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on your screen, and you can cancel any time. Now, if those tablets left you wondering, wait until you hear what a quantum machine revealed about who really built the pyramids. It may change everything you believed. That answer is starting right here, so stay with me.